Roy is practicing as an advocate before Bombay High Court and also Tribunal. He was junior to Sri Dinesh Vyas and also to Sri Dinesh Patil earlier. Since October 1984, Sri Roy is independently practicing as a counsel. He has appeared in various important landmark cases in Bombay High Court as well as Tribunal. We all have been benefited by various ratios which have been coming out of those decisions. And he has been a regular speaker at various forums, conferences, seminars of all the organizations like Chamber, GCA, and various such other organizations. With these very brief words, I would present before you Sri Roy and request all of you to welcome Sri Roy and the Lord. Today, the session which we have requested Sri Roy to deal with is some of the fundamental concepts like Hayden's rule, mischief rule, and where strict interpretation, liberal interpretation, etc., and absurdity, and also purposive interpretation. Before I request Sri Roy to deliver his talk, I would request Paras Bhai to offer a memento as a mark of love and respect to Sri Roy. I would request Hero sir to please address us.
Do you want to finish your snacks or can you go on? Okay. Okay, President Paras, Ketan, Rahul, and friends. A very good evening to each one of you here. My thanks to the Chamber for having called me over this evening to share a few thoughts with all of you here. I don't know whether the bifurcation of subjects has been circulated among you, but I have a little grudge with the organizers. They have done a great job trying to allocate the subjects among each speaker. But only question I have is that the total allocation runs into 5 pages. And out of 5 pages, 2 pages are given to me. So I really don't know how much of it I'll be able to cover, but nevertheless I'll try and cover some of the main aspects. I feel a little underdressed. I wish I knew that you all are all very good. Nevertheless, one request, particularly when I'm sitting, I don't feel I'm delivering a talk. So I would request all of you that if you feel that you need some clarification or you want to add something or you have some inputs in addition to what I'm saying, please feel free to do it at that point of time. Do not wait until the absolute end. So let it be more interactive rather than just a one-way talk. Principles of interpretation of statutes. Somebody has very nicely put it that language is at best an imperfect instrument for expression of human intention. Language being what it is, whichever language you take, is bound to be imperfect. That is what results in the necessity for interpretation. Simple example, speaking a little lightly. A man was hauled up for a parking offence and he was asked, why did you park your car there? So he replied very simply, he said, the sign said, fine for parking. So this is what happens when you have to interpret a problem. Another small example is, when you have some problems, some difficulties, somebody will advise you in Hindi. They'll say, bhag lo. Now, bhag lo can mean so many things. Bhag lo means bhag lo, and bhag lo means participate or face the problem. Whichever way you look at it, you interpret it in that particular manner. Most laws that we have, particularly tax laws, the difficulty arises because today the world has become very complex. And the law as it is drafted cannot possibly think of or conceive of all possible situations that are going to arise in the business world or that are going to arise in the real world. So when you have a situation, you try and fit it within the law that is already there. So this is what results in the necessity for interpreting the particular law which was enacted maybe some years ago. And you will notice even though even Income Tax Act is being amended every year, still you will find it falls short in so many places when we apply it to different situations which arise in the real world. It's because of this difficulty which has been felt since centuries that certain principles of interpretation have been evolved so as to assist the courts in bringing out the true intention of the legislature, what they had in mind while enacting the statute. Of course, this need for interpretation would arise only when there is some loose end or there is some flaw, some ambiguity, something unclear in the statute. Then the need for interpretation arises. Let's be very clear about one thing, that interpretation of statutes is not a very precise science. It is very subjective. I may come out with a strong principle and I can be equally countered strongly by another equally strong principle. For example, if I may say that this is an issue on which there are two possible views, so you take the view which is in favor of the assessee. The court might turn around and tell me that according to us, this is the only possible view which is against you. Therefore, there is no question of applying that so-called principle that you are seeking to. So it's all a matter of judgment. It's all a matter of what you feel on that particular issue at that particular point of time. Suppose you are to deliver a decision. So I just said the principles of interpretation have been evolved to assist the courts in cases where there are certain unclear things, there are certain lackings or failings in the statutes. Flowing out of this is the fundamental first principle that you have to follow the golden rule of interpretation, the literal rule of interpretation. That is the first and fundamental thing. Literal rule of interpretation is what you are supposed to apply first. All others will come later. All others are exceptions to this. This is fundamental. Now, what is interpretation? Simply speaking, interpretation means you are to find out the intention of the legislature. That's it. You have to find out the intention of the legislature. And a plethora of decisions have said that the intention of the legislature is best shown by the language used in the statute. This is what the literal interpretation means. Language, what is used in the statute, is the best indicator of the intention of the legislature. If the language is plain and clear, then you have to apply it, regardless of what is the consequence. The courts cannot substitute their own opinions, their own views, their own notions of justice so as to do damage to the plain, simple meaning of the statute. Fundamental, this is literal interpretation of the statute. Now, all this sounds very theoretical, I appreciate it. But these things can be illustrated best with cases. When you apply these principles to a specific case, then the principle goes it. A good example of literal interpretation is laid down by the Supreme Court in 247 ITR, page 821. Supreme Court, Vikrant Tyres Limited. I'm still giving you time to read, then you can start talking. What happened in this case was that there was an assessment made, a demand was raised, the assessee paid up the demand in time. It filed an appeal. The appeal was decided in favor at the CIT appeal and the tribunal stage. So the assessee got a refund. Department went up to the High Court and High Court decided the matter against the assessee. So the assessment order gets upheld. They demanded the tax from the assessee paid the tax. Department said you are liable to pay interest under section 222. This issue arose before the Supreme Court in this matter. Supreme Court says nothing will. No question of interest under section 222. They say, please see the simple language of section 221 and 222. The conditions are that there must be a demand and there should have been a default in payment of that demand within the stipulated period. This is a simple requirement of the section. Has there been a default by the assessee of non-payment within the stipulated period? He had paid the demand. If that be so, then where is the question of levying interest under section 220 subsection? Lovely illustration of literal interpretation. Law is simple and clear. That's what you have to apply. You need not go into the principle whether the department was deprived of the money all this time. What happens actually is that a revival of the demand takes place. All that happens when different situations arise. But here, 220 subsection 2 does not apply. The plain and simple conditions of 222 are not satisfied. Simple, little interpretation. Another example is another Supreme. I'll be dealing mainly with Supreme Court decisions, and some of them are old ones because these are the ones which are laying down these fundamental principles, and it is from here that one understands these issues. 237 ITR 589. Orissa State Warehousing Corporation and Rajasthan State Warehousing Corporation. This was a case of exemption under section 1029. Section 1029 provided for exemption to such authorities, such like state warehousing corporations, in respect of any income derived from the letting out of godowns or warehouses for the purposes of storage, processing, or facilitating the marketing of commodities. Storing, processing, or facilitating the marketing of commodities. Supreme Court says this section is crystal clear. If you have let it out for some other purposes, no question of getting exemption under section 1029. Simple. Therefore, if you have other incidental income arising out of the letting out of those premises, in that case it was FD interest and certain other charges, etc. This has got nothing to do. You do not fall within the plain words used in the statute. Classic examples of literal interpretation, the golden rule of interpretation. I do not want to multiply the cases. I'll just cite two decisions. We can read them at your leisure. These are recent decisions. 363 ITR, 658. This dealt with interest under 244A. And until what date was the interest payable to the deductor of tax? And 362 ITR 673, Supreme Court. 362 ITR 673, Supreme Court. This was in the context of recording of satisfaction under 158BD. You would recollect earlier we had decisions saying that even a special bench of the tribunal had held that to resort to section 158BD, the assessing officer of the searched person has to record a satisfaction. Fine. But those decisions had held that this satisfaction must be recorded prior to the completion of the assessment proceedings in the case of the person searched. Supreme Court says, please look at 158BD. Where do you get such a requirement? The section only says that the AO must record his satisfaction. There is no embargo on the time within which he is to record that satisfaction. So even if he did it at the stage of initiation of the proceeding in the case of the searched person, or at the time of the conclusion of the assessment in the case of the searched person, or even if shortly thereafter, which was the facts in that case, even if it was done thereafter, it is fine. Because there is nothing in this section, the plain words of this section do not have any such condition that that satisfaction must be recorded prior to the completion of the assessment of the searched person. This is, to my mind, one of the latest examples of the plain literal interpretation. Having seen what this is, if there are certain doubts, there are certain ambiguities in the statute, then certain other principles would come into being. And let's see what some of those principles are. Can I have a short break for my tea? Okay. Taking off of that, I said when you have something is unclear in the statute, there is an ambiguity in the statute, then these other principles would apply. One of them would be that you interpret the statute keeping in mind the subject, the object, and the purpose of the statute. In the event of there being something unclear, there being an ambiguity, you have to resort to this. A very good illustration, the best illustration according to me, object and purpose. 43B, sales tax pertaining to the last quarter. Supreme Court decision 224 IDR 677. Those of you are interested to go into interpretation, I would suggest that you go through these decisions at your leisure, because these lay down certain fundamental principles of interpretation of statute. 224 IDR 677, Supreme Court, Allied Motors Private Limited. There was this problem of the sales tax pertaining to the last quarter, which is normally payable in the next year. So there was a problem regarding the allowability of the sales tax pertaining to the last quarter, because you would normally pay it in the next year, therefore you would possibly get a deduction in the next year. So in 43B, a proviso was inserted by the statute by Finance Act 87. Finance Act 87 with effect from 1/4/87, saying that if you pay this sales tax by the due date for filing the return, then you need not get your deduction in the next year, you get it in this year itself. This was Finance Act 87 with effect from 1/4/87. But the department still had a problem. They say what is allowed under section 43B is any sum payable by the assessee during the previous year. Department's argument was that this amount pertaining to the last quarter is payable in the next year. So where is the question of your getting the benefit of that proviso? Because it's not satisfying that requirement of any sum payable. So yet again, explanation 2 inserted by the Finance Act 1989 with retrospective effect from 1/4/84. Note this, Finance Act 89 with retrospective effect from 1/4/84. That now sum payable means something for which you have incurred the liability, though it may be payable later on. So the requirement of sum payable is satisfied by the insertion of this explanation 2. But see what happens. This explanation 2 inserted by Finance Act 89 with retrospective effect from 1/4/84 and proviso inserted by Finance Act 87 with effect from 1/4/87. So proviso comes into effect with effect from 1/4/87, this is from 1/4/84. Again you have the problem for those things. This issue came up before the Supreme Court. Supreme Court says, what is the purpose and object of inserting explanation 2 with retrospective effect? What is the purpose? You had experienced certain difficulties. It is to take care of those difficulties. That was the purpose of inserting explanation 2. And therefore, if you do not construe the proviso also as retrospective, if you do not consider the proviso also as retrospective, the retrospective amendment of explanation 2 becomes meaningless. Is it clear? So they say it becomes meaningless. Therefore, keeping the object and purpose in mind of insertion of both these, you have to look at them together. Keeping in mind the object and purpose, even the proviso has to be given retrospective effect right from 1/4/84, though it was inserted with effect from 1/4/87. This is a classic example of interpreting a provision keeping in mind the object and purpose of the amendment. There is a relatively recent Supreme Court decision, but I will deal with slightly later. Sanjeev Lal, 365 RTR, page 389. Okay, might as well deal with it here only. Keeping the object and purpose in mind. Sanjeev Lal's case was a different kind of a matter, dealing with exemption under section 54. The assessees had obtained a residential house under a will. In December 2002, they agreed to sell that house. December 2002, they agreed to sell that house. They got certain advance monies also, some honest money they got. And they agreed to purchase a new house in April 2003. December 2002, agreement to sell, April 2003 purchase, falling within the period for 54 exemption. What happened was, some of the other heirs filed a suit in the court, challenging the will under which these assessees had got the property. And the court passed an interim order there restraining the assessee from dealing with the property. So could not sell the property. That dispute got settled slightly later on. It got settled slightly later on. And the assessee could enter into the document, the execution of the document and also registration in September 2004. September 2004. So when it filed its return, when they filed their return, they claimed exemption under 54 for the purchase of the new house. A.O. Smart fellow, he says, your transfer has taken place in September 2004. Your purchase is April 2003. It is beyond that period of 1 year prior to the transfer of the asset. So I am not going to grant you the exemption under section 54. Supreme Court says, here we are interpreting a section which is granting an exemption. The purpose of this section, the object of this section is to grant you an exemption and not charge tax from you when you reinvest your capital gains in the purchase of another property. That is the object and purpose. And just because there are certain conditions which are beyond your control, the order of the court was something beyond this person's control, they could not do anything about it. So just because there are certain events which are occurring over which you had no control, does not mean that you are to be denied the exemption. So keeping the object and purpose of the exemption under section 54 in mind, Supreme Court says yes, you are eligible for the exemption under section 54. There are certain other issues arising out of this decision, but I don't want to bother you at the moment with that.
When Supreme Court was dealing with the transfer definition, then how can they deviate from the transfer?
You can't tell that to the Supreme Court. How can you deviate?
I'm just discussing.
Yes.
How far it will be correct to interpret it like this? Again,
See, Ashok,
yeah.
let's not get into correctness or otherwise of decisions.
No, we are
All
not-
the more of Supreme Court. We are nobody. We are nobody to get into that.
No, we have to discuss thinking that whether sometimes it can be revisited. Because see, the transfer definition should go as per the Act and 247, 5, 6.
They have also dealt with the transfer.
Yeah.
They say 247 also includes extinguishment of rights. And they have said that when you entered into the agreement to sell in December 2002, there was an extinguishment of some rights. That's what they say. There was an extinguishment of some rights, and simultaneously there were some rights created in the hands of the purchaser. Therefore, they say, particularly considering this definition of transfer, which includes extinguishment of rights, and also more importantly, considering the fact that you are considering an exemption provision, this is the view that the Supreme Court has taken. Now, if you want to stretch further and create problems for yourself, then you will have situations where you merely enter into an agreement to transfer, nothing happens in that transaction. Forget 53, you don't even give possession, you just take 15 or 10% earnest money, and department might rely upon this decision and say your transfer has taken place. That's another situation.
No, that is the
That's an offshoot of decision.
In fact, the tribunal members are asking why you do not apply family law in some cases.
Fair enough. Let's get a decision from them. Let's get a decision from them. You know, I don't think as of now we have a decision from the tribunal. As of now, I'm not aware of any decision
No,
from them.
there is no decision.
Fair.
It was a question from the member.
Fair enough, fair enough. Appreciate it. You are looking at 247.5, 53A.
I see.
Yeah, I have a matter next week before a tough match. Let's see what happens. Anyway, this was one, keeping the object and purpose in mind. Another very good illustration, which I think is of great practical utility, though we are at the tribunal stage on this, but it is of great practical utility. This deals with 40A1A. See, in 40A1A, Finance Act 12 has inserted the second proviso to say that even if you have not deducted tax, but if in terms of 2011 proviso, you are not in default. I'll explain what 2011 proviso is. It says, even if you have not deducted tax, but if you are not in default due to 2011 proviso, then it shall be deemed that you have deducted and paid the tax on the date of filing the return by the payee. So therefore, 40A1A disallowance will not apply. This is by the Finance Act 12 with effect from 1/4/13. 2011 proviso says that if the payee has filed the return under section 139, payee has taken into account this income while computing its income, the payee has paid the tax on its returned income, and if you get the prescribed form from the chartered accountant saying that these three conditions have been satisfied, then you will not be in default for the purpose of 2011. So if these conditions are satisfied, you will not be in default, and therefore read with the second proviso to 40A1A, since you are not in default, you are deemed to have satisfied the conditions of 40A1A, no disallowance under 40A1. Now, the issue is, these provisions have been inserted by the Finance Act 12 with effect from 1/4/13. Assessees have been taking up the argument and the tribunals have accepted. The first decision on this was the Agra bench, 34 ITR 479, both reading. 34 ITR 479 tribunals, Agra bench, Rajiv Kumar Agarwal. This decision holds, what is the object of section 40A1A? Now that you have got the second proviso read with 2011, what is the object? The object and purpose of this is that an assessee is not to be subjected to the disallowance if the government has got its tax. This is the object and purpose. So therefore, why should this not be construed as retrospective? What is done now with effect from 1/4/2013 is only something declaratory. It is only to clarify the provisions. Because the intention of the government is not, whatever they may have intended, fine. But legally, the bench says the intention is not to disallow it when the government has already got its money. Therefore, these are to be interpreted as if they are retrospective, right from AY 5/6 of whichever provision you fall under from the year in which you are supposed to deduct tax, so that you do not fall for disallowance under section 40A1. String of other decisions of the various benches have followed this Agra bench, including Mumbai Tribunal. If you are interested, this is in November 14 BCA Journal, page 37. This is a Mumbai bench decision. We also have Rajkot, Delhi, Bangalore, all taking the view in favor of the SSC that this amendment is to be construed retrospectively. The main logic being that what was the object and purpose. When we refer to object and purpose, I think there's sufficient warming up now. You should get something from the floor now. When you speak of object, and please don't hesitate, nobody is here to put anybody down. We are just sharing thoughts. So if you have something to add, it will be very nice. When you speak of object and purpose, there's a very nice rule called the mischief rule or Hayden's rule. Heydons, Hayden's rule. Hayden's was a decision rendered in England some 425 years odd ago. And that principle holds good even today. This is an aid to construction, the mischief rule, the Hayden's rule. What does it say? It says that what was the position of law before you enacted this law? What was the situation that was not covered by the law? How has the law now plugged that situation? And what is the object behind this amendment? So these four questions are to be asked and answered to arrive at the correct interpretation of a provision.
Only that four questions.
The fourth question. What are the four questions?
What is the true reason for the amendment?
No.
What is the true reason and how has the legislature got into this? There are four things. What was the position in law before? What was the situation that was not taken care of by the legislature? How has it taken care? What has it done? And what is the object behind this amendment? These are the four questions. There have been many cases on Hayden's rule. If you just click the CD, you will get a few decisions explaining what is Hayden's rule. But just one example. Section 55A, reference to the DVO. When you compute capital gains, you are entitled to substitute the fair market value of your asset as on 1481. Of course, you should have acquired the asset prior to 1481. So you are entitled to substitute the value as on 1481. So obviously, assessees try to jack up the value as much as possible as on 1481 so that the capital gain liability comes down. AOs were making references to the DVOs under section 55A. And the provision in law was when the AO was of the opinion, he can make a reference to the DVO when the AO was of the opinion that the value claimed is less than the fair market value. Now the situation which we are trying to envisage, it can never be a case of less than the fair market value. Because you are always trying to jack up your, so it is always a case of more than the fair market value. So 55A was taking care of a situation where it is less than the fair market value. That was what 55A was referring to. So the law realized, okay, this is a problem, this is a mischief which is taking place. So now the amendment has been made by the Finance Act 12 to say that instead of lesser than the fair market value, it is at variance with the fair market value. So while interpreting this provision, now you have to see what was the position in law before, what was the problem in the law, the situation you did not take care of, what is the amendment made, and what is the intention behind this amendment. All these four questions fit into this particular amendment made in 55A. So the object is therefore to plug that loophole.
We say that this will be in the retrospective. I mean, in a way, the way we looked at it earlier, since this was a clarificatory kind of thing.
That's another issue, that whether it is clarificatory. It is inserted by Finance Act 12 with effect from 1/7/12. But we have a Bombay High Court decision which says that this applies only from 1/7/12. How correct it is, we are not to go into it, but as of now, Bombay High Court has said that this applies from 1/7/12. And it's Puja Prince, that's the name of the decision. So we're through with Hayden's rule, object, purpose. Let's come to another principle. Here also Supreme Court has laid down certain principles. Fundamental rule, literal interpretation. But if that literal interpretation results in something which is absurd, which was something never envisaged by the law, which could never have been the intention of the law, then what happens? I will explain it with reference to Supreme Court decision. 131 ITR 597. Very celebrated decision, KP Varghese. I don't know how many of you all would have gone through this decision. Most of you all are youngsters here. I am going back to several decades. But these are fundamental decisions worth reading. KP Varghese, lovely judgment. 52(2), that time it was a provision in the statute, where there was a difference between the consideration shown by the assessee and the fair market value of the asset for capital gains purposes. Difference between the consideration and the fair market value. Department says the moment there is a difference between the consideration you have shown and the fair market value, 52(2) is attractive, and therefore we are going to charge that difference to tax. Clear? This is the contention of the department. Supreme Court says nothing doing. Supreme Court says that you could have a perfectly bona fide transaction because of which you sold your property or your asset at a price lesser than its fair market value. How can you bring it to charge, to tax, something the assessee has not received? I am implying